to my daughter, never forget that I love you. I hope you believe in yourself as much as I believe in you. When life tries to knock you down, I will always have your back. I can't promise to be here for the rest of your life, but what I can promise is that I'll love you for the rest of mine.
Every advantage I found, couldn't find a better fit for them, along with my crown. And since the baton was passed, I've been down, cause failing's not an option, and dad is not a noun, not at all.
Welcome to another episode of Dad is Not a Noun. My name is Ishmael, changing the narrative for men of color fatherhood, as well as changing the narrative on the things I care about. And on today's episode of this amazing podcast, I have an amazing guest with me, and we're going to be talking about the impact of white flight and meaning. And my special guest today is Dr. Owens. Dr. Owens, thank you for coming on to the show. Dr. Owens is the education director at Georgia Budget and Policy Institution. Dr. Owens advocates for diverse inclusion and excellent public schools through the research and data analysis. Prior to joining GBPI in 2018, Dr. Owens was a research and data analysis at the Georgia Department of Education. He created data visualization to help districts and state policymakers better understand school outcomes, assist in the creation of Georgia's plan to implement federal education legislation like the Every Student Succeed Act, and proceeded to analyze that shape public policy of Georgia schools. Sir, he also graduated from the University of Georgia. I'm sorry about your Bulldogs. Sorry
okay.
I had to with that.
Oh man,
I'm sorry about that.
Tough to bring it back up, but no, I appreciate the condolences.
But thank you for coming on the show. I ask all my guests who comes on the show the first question, because I'm all about mental health. And my question to you: how's your heart at this moment?
Full. So I've got a lot of kids, and we've got an almost 11-month-old now who's just the sweetest. And so if y'all hear any background noise, it's because I am out at a coffee shop recording this, because there's just a lot of noise, but a lot of love in my house. And we've got the holidays coming up. So, yeah, it's in a good spot. Thank you for asking.
No problem. And before we get into the conversation, where did your love for just education and numbers, where did that start from?
I will say my love for numbers it took a while to develop. I grew up in the public school system all the way from kindergarten through graduate degree. And as I was working on my doctorate, it became clear to me that while public schools can't do everything, it's got to be a schools and. It is an incredible tool to alleviate poverty and to lessen the amount of human suffering in this world, especially the way the United States has it set up, or the ideals kind of set up in it. And I've always had a gift with math, just not a lot of enjoyment around it until it started paying the bills. So once you can get employed for it, it makes it a lot easier. And so those things came together in my current role, where we advise a lot of lawmakers and the public about education policy, where we advocate for a just and inclusive public school system.
And I think that's important, because in this conversation, I want to separate emotion from data.
Right.
In this conversation. But let's start with that terminology, white flight. What is the definition of white flight?
So they're going to be people who have like really good academic definitions. I think it's one of those things that people know it when they see it, though. So what this means generally is that the arrival of people of color into a neighborhood or into a community leads white folks to act collectively. A lot of times we think we're acting kind of just our individual preferences, but you show over the entire, over like a 10, 15-year period. And it seems like it's this decision by folks in the white community to move out. And a lot of times this happens ostensibly because of the discussions around the quality of the school. So this is personal for me. I grew up in South suburban Atlanta, in Riverdale, Georgia, which was one of the original white fight places from in-town Atlanta. that a lot of white families left these major metropolitan areas and moved to the suburbs. A lot of white folks moved to Riverdale, and then as people of color moved into Riverdale, white folks moved to the next county over, and our family did the same. I've said, we're in the red eye flight, because when I was in kindergarten at E.W. Oliver Elementary in Riverdale, majority white school, by the time I was in 5th grade, there were 2 other white kids in my class. And then we moved to Fayette County, one invisible line over. And not only were there a lot more white folks there, but the schools were better resourced. And I bring this up because a lot of times white folks will talk about it like, oh, we just wanted better schools, without ever discussing how the moving of resources from A to B makes schools how they are. The way that we fund schools in the United States, which is purely an American invention. We don't find this any other country, definitely no other industrialized country in the world, that has a significant portion of the school is funded by how much money the houses and properties are worth in the area. So in my studies, and you don't have to go to grad school to understand this, we know that there's a strong connection between wealth and race because of racism. Not because of the value of a person, but because for hundreds of years, communities of color have been stolen from or denied resources, specifically public resources. And the way you hand the vast majority of your money down is through inheritance to your kin. So the end result is, even when you get rid of racist laws, a lot of times we have this racial wealth gap because when what is it Dr. King said? If you finish stabbing someone 11 times, just taking the knife out doesn't heal them. And so that's what we have in this country, is this significant wealth gap. And we have schools that are funded based on like the wealth of communities. And so it's a long kind of winding answer to get to. White flight is this decision by white folks to move away once people of color become their neighbors. And a lot of times it's talked about in a way about school quality without any recognition of the culpability, any recognition of the way that racism helped set up the situation that we have today, because there's no good reason to have schools so different county to county or town to town.
No, and I agree with you 100%. And I could make a case that this is nothing more than an extension of Jim Crow.
Absolutely. Yeah. Why else would we have like boundaries on schools where like the houses are so expensive that folks can't get in? And that those expensive houses then determine the quality of schools. I'm a firm believer that when the average white American describes a good school, it has very little to do with student outcomes, test scores, because that's what we're kind of led to believe, right? Is that like, oh, it's all about getting into that great school, doing really well in the SAT or whatever. I think it has so much more to do about who can we exclude, who can we keep out. Because you think about how like the Harvards and Yales of this world are talked about. Like, look at how few people get in. Yeah. Right. The average American confuses exclusion with excellence. And yeah, that comes directly from Jim Crow. This idea that white equals quality and that black equals lack of quality, that was built into the policies. But the way that we fund schools, that remained. That's one of those vestiges of racism that remained.
And I think what plays a major role with that too is I remember in 2006, Yale University did a study on implicit bias. And I think that plays in the perception of white communities moving out because of their perception of black people, especially black men, where the research was they had a bunch of pre-K teachers.
That's right.
And they had students, and they just had them just not follow what the kids were doing because they were sitting down at a table, and because of this historical bias towards black boys and men, those teachers was focusing on the black boy. He wasn't doing anything. He was just doing what the other kids around him was doing, but their primarily focus was on him because of the notion of being a troublemaker, being arrested and things like that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it plays into the macro level when we think about what is a good school, what's a good neighborhood, quote unquote, right? All the way down to exactly what you described, that micro level of what do we expect from our children? Because we also know that there's just a huge connection between how much teachers think a child can accomplish and then what standard they'll hold them to. That it is very helpful to hold kids to a really high standard, not to then, punish every kid who gets a C, criminalize missing school, but this idea of kind of what do we expect from our kids, specifically black boys. It shows up absolutely early on that kids, by the time they're in kindergarten, have a sense of whether or not they think that they're a good student or not, and that comes from the adults in their lives. So you're getting at not only the perceptions of these kids, but what is the makeup of the teachers that are assessing them? Because we see the gains that happen in a child's life, specifically a black child's life, if they have at least one black teacher. Right. And the benefits, it actually does better for everyone. It's good for white and Asian American students, everyone. It benefits everyone. And another stat I'll bring up that you're making me think of too is I did a report a couple years ago about students with disabilities, special education. The United States has more kids in special ed programs than any other industrialized nation. And we are way overrepresented in the amount of black boys in special education. And that has nothing to do with the intelligence and has so much more to do about what do we think of when we think of like a child, quote unquote, struggling. Does that have more to say about our views on gender and race than actual ability inside the classroom? So it hurts everyone. It hurts those kids who are over-identified for special education because now a lot of times they're in a segregated classroom. The standards are much lower for these students, and it hurts those kids who could use special education services who are missing out on it because they might just be wealthier or they might fit into our mental model rather of what a good kid is. So this is, it kind of continues that concept, which is that racism hurts everybody. But it's particularly at that intersection of race and gender that we see in studies like the one you mentioned, and the way that we view discipline and the way that we view special education. I mean, you see it over the entire spectrum of the education system.
Right. And in reverse, it's crazy how like you had the ending of affirmative action, and then you have white communities leaving because Asian communities are moving in the community because they fear that their kids are less, I would say, are inferior to Asian kids. If you want to talk about that, because again, that's
Absolutely.
another dynamic of what we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a study that was published just recently in California, but we've seen the results elsewhere. That for every 2 Asian kids that enrolled in the school, rather, 3 white kids would move out from the school, and not just to a private or home school. We're talking move away from the community altogether. And the research suggests that it comes from this place that white folks feel that their children might not have a competitive advantage because of the very real fact that Asian American students outperform white kids on standardized tests. And so a lot of times it's a change in the goalposts of kind of what do I want my school to be? I don't want it to be too competitive, but you don't hear a lot of folks say that when their child is exceeding compete next to their peers, right? And obviously, this is bad morally when you view kind of your kids as like, okay, I need not only for them to get a good education, to get a better education than other people, but also I think it really hits at kind of one of the root sins of American education the past 30-ish years, which is that we have to be in direct competition. And so what happens is we no longer think about, okay, what's a good level of education for all children to receive? We think in a scarcity mindset, because for my child to win, I need your child to lose. Yeah. And that, I wouldn't say that pushes, but I would say that encourages the scarcity mindset that exacerbates long-held racist biases about the way the white people feel about Asian students, feel about Black and Hispanic students. It leaves kind of few places to hide, as far as kind of in your mind about like, okay, what do I actually want out of my school, or do I just want other people to fail so that I can feel like I'm succeeding? That's a bleak view of humanity, I would say.
And I totally agree with that, because in the birth of this nation, to make it, you had to be identified as white. And then as different minority groups came into the country, for them to make it, they had to identify themselves as white, because there's been like many cases that went to the Supreme Court of different ethnic groups that wanted that status of white just to make it in America.
Absolutely. And I think it encourages a type of anxiety that's bad for all of us.
Yeah.
Let me give an example. So Georgia has this policy that we debate every single year called private school vouchers. The idea of using public funds, private education expenses. This has been primarily pushed by white conservative evangelicals as a way to pay for private Christian schooling. But I'll see a lot of families across racial and ideological spectrum who say that, like, if the state isn't going to pay for strong public schools, then why wouldn't I try to get into one of those elite private schools? And I understand, and I have nothing against kind of like, I understand parents make difficult decisions with imperfect information, but it feeds that kind of narrative, which is like, how can I get into those white spaces? Right. And how can I get, that kind of, that slice of the pie that rich landowning white Protestants have always had or stolen in this country, that has been denied to so many other people. And I think the end result is we'll see that, like, kind of while maybe politically white folks might need to expand in order to get some sort of coalition,
right?
They're always coming back for it. No. And what I mean by that is in Florida, Governor DeSantis, they have a very big voucher program. He has not allowed vouchers to go to these few private schools that have some sort of connection to mainland China. And so you can kind of, and he said it's a national security thing. I do not believe him, but that's my own kind of personal stance. Right. And but you can see that it's not just going to be like, okay, everyone could build their own great private school. It feels like it's going to center back around like, okay, how do we then again center those white spaces and white priorities? Because the idea that people are going to continue to give just government money with nothing in return, I've yet to see that, especially in the education space. So I hate how it encourages a type of anxiety for all of us, right, of kind of, okay, how do I just get my kid into that inner circle? Yes. Without recognizing that we need to dismantle the boundaries of the circle in general.
And I totally agree with you 100%, because it goes back to the basic principles. When you're cutting funding and now you say, hey, I got a remedy, let's do these vouchers. And again, people don't read the bill. Like, I love the video you posted about, what was it, in Arizona, that they tried to pass this voucher bill and it was struck down because they read the bill.
That's right. Yeah, it ends up being more of it's very deferential to the private schools, and doesn't really do anything for kids, because I stand with parents who look at the public school system and say, like, my child's not getting the education they need. I advocate every single day to improve the public education system. I just want to make sure that we've got kids' civil rights intact, that kind of whichever direction we go with education doesn't come with an unfair trade, that I can give you the chance at maybe a good education, but you have to trade some of this hard-fought civil rights for people of color, students with disabilities, English language learners, etc.
But I do like that key phrase you said, kiss civil rights to education. So how in a rainbow color world that we hope that exists, what would that look like?
Gosh, this is a great question. I'll be honest. I think it would happen outside the school. We could do this stuff, a lot of these things inside the school, and that's, my purview and my policy area. It just gets more expensive inside the school. I will say I'm willing to go further than maybe most, even inside of the policy circles I'm in, is that like we know about the monumental harm and theft that took place through 400 years of chattel slavery, Jim Crow segregation. Why don't we ever mention, why doesn't the wider policy area ever mention reparations as recognition of like, okay, this is what it looks like to repay harm, or to at least recognize harm. And so, but if folks aren't willing to go to reparations with me, look at things like the child tax credit that recognize like, okay, we need to support families, specifically families with lower income, straight with cash, to the point of trusting families. We'll see if we were to continue a program like that. And then other supports like Medicaid expansion, like strong public health, public transportation. What we'd see is there'd be improvements in the schools. Then we wouldn't need our schools to spend so much being the safety net for students. Like having school lunches is fantastic. I think what's better is that mom and dad have money in their pockets so that they can make lunches themselves, right? And again, I'm not against school lunches, but these sort of things are a patchwork quilt in the one area where we're willing to support all kids. I'd rather that show up in so many other areas, so it doesn't all have to fall on the schools, to have a robust safety net that recognizes the harm. The way that we say it is that race came into account when the United States government and state governments were instituting harm for generations, right? So that needs to come into account when we talk about how to redistribute the nation's wealth. And so we would have to think about, okay, what does it look like racial justice in distribution of things like tax credits, of public health, public transportation, housing, across the gamut.
And I agree with that. And one lesson we can learn from is what Australia did reparation-wise for the Aboriginals in Australia. That's one method idea we can use. Maybe not similar, but something that's close to it. But this has been an amazing conversation. I can talk to you for like hours about this because it's just amazing. And when it comes to like things that I care about, I love this. My last question to you: what advice do you have for parents when it comes to this issue? Because a lot of parents are not informed of like these issues.
Yeah.
So what advice do you have for them?
Well, I'll be completely frank that I'm stealing this directly from Nicole Hannah-Jones. I was able to interview her at our annual conference years ago. One of my highlights of my professional life thus far. And one of her kind of guiding light is when I go to advocate for my child, is it something that's just going to help them? Like, is it just going to help her child get ahead, or will it actually help everyone? Like, there's one thing to say, like, my child was this close to getting into the gifted program. Let me get them, let me pull some strings to get them in that gifted program, versus why couldn't we treat every child like a gifted child? Why don't we distribute the resources in a way? Why don't, we help support the teachers so they can provide a lot of these same prompts and supports for these kids? And that's what I try to use in my own life as well. So I'm not trying to, so I don't end up, I hope, weaponizing like my white privilege, which is, okay, when I go to advocate, which we all need to be doing, right? And that is natural and good to push for the good of your own child. Does this require somebody else being lesser than? or does this lift everyone up? So that would be my goal, that when you notice those things in your school, in your community, in your child's homework, etc., that kind of keep an eye out for, is this something that supports the whole class or just my child?
No, I totally agree with that. Plain and simple, it's just like sports. You know how people rally around their sports teams? Let's do that when it comes to education,
That's
and
exactly
that
right.
should be my priority.
Yes. Yeah. Well said.
But yeah, this has been a great conversation. How can people follow you? Find you?
You can find me. I'm Stephen Owens on Twitter, TikTok. My handles are Stephen J Owens _ Stephen with a PH. My mom called me that, so I would never get called Steve. And then Steve Urkel came out in the 90s and just ruined the name Stephen for a generation. And now Steph Curry has everybody mispronouncing my name. Anyway, and so, yeah, Stephen J Owens _ on Twitter, TikTok. Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. This has been great.
No, thank you for having me on. This has been another amazing conversation here on That Is Not a Noun podcast. Like, subscribe, follow me on iTunes, Spotify, wherever you type in That Is Not a Noun. You'll find me, as well as this amazing conversation with Dr. Owens. And again, we're out. Peace.